One projectile hit one tanker off the coast of Oman, and within hours, the number every trader, insurer, and war room analyst was quietly running turned out to be the same: 20%. 20% of the entire world's oil supply, one warning shot away from chaos. I want you to hold on to that number for the next 30 minutes, okay? 20%. Not a rough estimate, not a scare number some pundit made up for a headline. This is the actual documented share of global oil trade that passes through a single 33-mile wide waterway between Iran and Oman called the Strait of Hormuz. And on the early morning of Tuesday, July 6th, at 1:19 a.m. local time, an unidentified projectile slammed into the port side of a commercial tanker roughly 8 nautical miles off the coast of Lima, Oman, and set it on fire. No casualties, minor damage. The ship kept moving. On paper, a minor incident. In practice, the opening move in a week that would put a fifth of the planet's energy supply back on a knife's edge, all triggered by attacks that individually barely made a dent in a single ship's hull. So here's the question I want you to actually sit with today. How does one drone, one projectile, one relatively contained strike on a single vessel, translate into a threat capable of shaking global oil markets, spiking insurance premiums by hundreds of thousands of dollars per voyage, and triggering a full U.S. sanctions reversal within hours? Is this really about one rogue attack, or is there something much more calculated happening underneath it? Today, I'm going to walk through 3 competing explanations for why these strikes matter so disproportionately more than their physical size suggests. I'm going to use nothing but on-record reporting from the British military, the U.S. Navy's own Maritime Coordination Center, Reuters, the Associated Press, and independent maritime intelligence analysts. And then I'm going to show you why the real explanation isn't Iran got lucky with an easy target. It's a deliberate, documented strategy that turns minimal military force into maximum economic leverage. 3 theories, same set of facts. Only one framework explains all of it. Are you ready? Let's go. Before I get into the evidence, you need the 3 theories by name, because if you don't understand the categories, you can't judge the evidence properly, okay? Theory number 1 is what I'll call the isolated incident theory. This is exactly what it sounds like. Tuesday's tanker strikes were a scattered, opportunistic act, maybe a rogue IRGC unit, maybe retaliation for something specific and unrelated, with no larger strategic logic behind the timing or the targets chosen. Theory number 2 is what I'll call the route war theory. This says the strikes aren't random at all. They're part of a specific, sustained campaign to force global shipping onto routes Iran controls and can eventually charge tolls on. And every ship hit so far has been hit for a specific, trackable reason tied to which route it was using. And theory number 3, the one I'm going to build for you today, I call the 20% lever. This says Iran has figured out something genuinely dangerous. That in a choke point carrying a fifth of the world's oil, you don't need a real blockade to create blockade-level economic damage. You only need enough scattered, deniable violence to make insurers, shippers, and governments behave as if a blockade already exists. Let's take them one at a time. Theory 1, the isolated incident. I want to be fair to this theory because on the surface, Tuesday's specific attack does look scattered rather than coordinated. Here's the strongest version of the case. The July 6th strike hit an unidentified vessel. The British military's own Maritime Trade Center couldn't immediately confirm ownership or flag. The following day's strikes hit 3 different ships. The Qatari-owned LNG tanker Al Rekayat, the Saudi-flagged supertanker Wedian, and a third vessel struck by what was described as a drone. 3 different flags, 3 different cargo types, 3 different companies. If this were a tightly coordinated campaign with a single strategic goal, you might expect a more consistent target profile. Not this apparent grab bag of ships that happened to be in the wrong stretch of water at the wrong time. And crucially, no one officially claimed responsibility. Iranian state media suggested Iran's involvement without an actual official claim. Qatar accused Iran directly and said Doha considered Iran fully legally responsible, but that's an accusation, not a confession. In the fog of an active ongoing war, with more than 15 ships attacked in this waterway since the conflict began back on February 28th, it's genuinely plausible that any individual strike in that 15-plus count could be opportunistic, semi-autonomous, or even attributable to smaller proxy actors operating with loose coordination rather than a single strategic mind directing every hit. So if you're looking for a simple explanation, this one is reasonable on its face. War creates chaos. Chaos produces scattered violence. Scattered violence doesn't need a grand unifying theory behind every single incident. But here's the problem, and this is the single most important question in this entire video, okay? So pay attention to this one. If these were truly random, opportunistic strikes, facts with no larger logic. Why did Iranian state media specifically frame the July 6th attack as punishment for a ship ignoring, quote, repeated warnings about using what it called the Omani route? And why did Tehran's own Persian Gulf Strait Authority separately warn, in writing weeks earlier, that any vessel transiting outside its approved routes could not have its security guaranteed? Think about that. That's not the language of chaos. That's the language of a toll booth operator explaining the rules before enforcing them. A truly random actor doesn't pre-announce which routes are dangerous and then strike ships specifically for using the routes it warned them about. That's not scattered violence. That's enforcement. Theory 2. The route. War. This is where it gets genuinely interesting, and I need to walk you through 5 specific pieces of evidence, all from mainstream maritime and financial reporting. Not speculation. Source number 1. Weeks before the February 28th strikes even began, war risk insurance premiums for ships transiting the strait had already jumped from around 0.125% of a vessel's insured value to somewhere between 0.2% and 0.4%. For a very large crude carrier, that's an increase of roughly $250,000 per single transit, priced in before a single shot was fired in this specific phase of the conflict. That tells you the market itself already understood this wasn't going to be random. Source 2. Iran's own Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a body founded specifically during this conflict, issued written warnings to shipping companies that vessels attempting to transit outside its approved routes could not have their security insured. That's a direct, on-the-record statement establishing which routes are safe and which aren't, months before enforcement action against specific ships. Source 3. Michelle Wies-Bachmann, a senior maritime intelligence analyst at Windward, a respected maritime data firm, told CNBC directly that this is obviously a battle for control, because the only real leverage Iran has in this entire conflict is control of Hormuz itself. That's an independent industry analyst with no political stake in either side, explicitly describing this as a control campaign, not scattered chaos. Source 4. According to PBS's own reporting, citing sourcing on the negotiations, Tehran has insisted throughout the interim deal process that it must control which routes vessels use through the strait, and that it intends to eventually charge fees for passage, a direct upending of decades of established maritime practice in that waterway. That's not incidental information. That's Iran's actual stated negotiating position, confirmed independently of any single attack. Source 5. And this is the part that shows just how effective the strategy already is. According to maritime data firm Kepuler, more than 100 ships passed through Hormuz over a single recent weekend, which sounds like a lot until you compare it to pre-war baselines. Before this conflict, more than 100 ships transited daily, and crude oil exports through the strait totaled more than 15 million barrels per day. By June of this year, according to Windward's own data, that number had collapsed to roughly 4.3 million barrels per day. That's a collapse of more than 70% in the actual flow of oil through the world's single most important energy chokepoint, achieved without a single full formal blockade ever being declared. So when you put these 5 pieces together, the insurance market pricing and the risk before the shooting even started, Iran's own Strait Authority publishing route warnings in advance, an independent analyst calling this exactly what it looks like, a battle for control, Tehran's own stated intention to eventually charge tolls, and the actual measurable 70% collapse. In oil flow through the strait, you start to see a very different picture than scattered, opportunistic violence. The picture is a deliberate campaign to make global shippers choose Iran's approved routes, on Iran's terms, under Iran's future toll structure, using just enough targeted, deniable force to make the alternative feel too dangerous to risk. The data, what actually happened, week by week. Now let me give you the actual granular timeline, because theory without data is just storytelling, and I want you to be able to verify every piece of this yourself. Before this specific war even began, back in the lead-up to February 28th, both Iran and Saudi Arabia had already anticipated the risk. From February 15th to 20th, Iran actually tripled its normal oil export rate while simultaneously reducing its oil storage levels, specifically to minimize the value of any storage facility that could be struck. Saudi Arabia made similar preemptive moves. Around that same window, Iran briefly and temporarily closed part of the strait as an explicit warning shot, well before the full war started, establishing the pattern of using partial disruption as a signal rather than immediately going for a total shutdown. Once the war began on February 28th, ships started coming under sporadic fire almost immediately, and by early March, Iran had already signaled it would only guarantee safe passage for Chinese-flagged vessels, explicitly citing China's supportive posture during the conflict, a clear early sign that safety in this waterway was going to be a political and economic tool, not a neutral maritime standard. Throughout March and April, individual attacks continued. A Hapag-Lloyd container ship hit by projectile fragments, a Kuwaiti-flagged gas tanker struck off Fujairah, a French shipping company's vessel targeted, each incident small on its own, each one adding to a slowly accumulating pattern of risk that insurers and shippers had to price in continuously. By mid-June, the two sides had reached an interim deal, signed on June 17th, allowing ships to pass without transit fees for a 60-day window while the broader negotiation continued. Ship traffic began to recover, though it remained far below pre-war levels even at its best point during that recovery window. Then came the first week of July. Iran's multi-day funeral processions for its slain supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, began, and less than a week into those processions, on Tuesday, July 6th, the projectile strike near Lima hit that unidentified tanker. Iranian state broadcasting specifically named the Qatari tanker Al-Rekayat and claimed it had been targeted for ignoring repeated warnings about using what Tehran called the Omani route. The very next day, Wednesday, July 7th, 3 separate tankers were struck within the same 24-hour window, the most attacks in a single day since late April, according to the UN's International Maritime Organization. Al-Rekayat suffered a fire in its engine room severe enough that the crew evacuated over fears the ship could explode. The Saudi-flagged Wedyan was also damaged. A third vessel was struck by a drone. Location data from the British Maritime Agency showed all 3 attacks occurred off the coast of Oman or the neighboring United Arab Emirates, meaning every single ship hit was using the southern route near Oman, the exact route the U.S. Navy had specifically expanded and publicly declared open for all traffic just days earlier. Hours after that third strike, the U.S. Treasury revoked the 60-day license it had issued the previous month, waiving sanctions on Iranian oil sales. Shortly after, CENTCOM announced a fresh wave of airstrikes on Iranian military sites near the Strait. The Joint Maritime Information Center, the multinational body coordinating naval and merchant shipping safety out of Bahrain, raised the threat level in the Strait to severe, specifically citing the likelihood of what it called deliberate hostile action under current conditions. And in the background of all of it, oil exports through the Strait, which had been running at more than 15 million barrels a day as of June, even during the supposedly calmer interim period. Theory 3, the 20% lever. Now let me put it all together because this is where the real explanation lives. Here's the core idea. Iran cannot realistically win a full, sustained conventional war against the combined military weight of the United States and Israel, and everyone involved, including Tehran, knows that. What Iran does have uniquely is geography. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 33 miles wide at its narrowest point, and roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil, and a significant share of global liquefied natural gas moves through that narrow channel every single day. That single geographic fact means Iran doesn't need to fight a war. It can win in the traditional sense. It only needs to make the cost. Its preferred routes and preferred rules feel high enough that the rest of the world manages itself into compliance. Look at the actual mechanics of what a handful of scattered strikes accomplished. A handful of projectile and drone strikes, none of which sank a single ship, none of which killed a single sailor, and the incidents we've covered today still managed to trigger a 70% collapse in oil flow through the Strait compared to pre-war levels, $250,000. Insurance premium increase per large tanker transit, a full U.S. sanctions reversal within hours, and a threat level escalation to severe from the very body responsible for coordinating global shipping safety in that corridor. That is an enormous return on a very small, very cheap, very deniable military investment. And you don't need to blockade 20% of the world's oil supply. You only need to make insurers, shipping companies, and governments behave as though you might at any moment, and the actual economic damage takes care of itself. And this is exactly why the target pattern in Theory 2 matters so much. Every single ship hit in that critical week was using the specific southern route near Oman that the U.S. Navy had just expanded and declared safe for all traffic. That's not coincidence, and it's not randomness. It's a direct, deniable response to the one alternative route that threatened to make Iran's own approved northern corridor irrelevant. By hitting ships specifically on the U.S.-backed route, Iran raises the cost of using it without ever having to formally claim responsibility for a single strike, preserving just enough plausible deniability to avoid a full-scale, unambiguous casus belli, while still achieving the actual economic goal, keeping global shipping nervous enough to consider Iran's approved, eventually toll-charging route as the safer bet. That's the 20% lever. It's not chaos, and it's not simply enforcement of arbitrary rules either. It's the calculated exploitation of a single geographic choke point, where a tiny amount of visible, semi-deniable violence produces an economic shockwave, completely disproportionate to the actual military force used. specifically because the rest of the world has no choice but to treat that 20% of global oil supply as too important to gamble with. 3 things to watch for in the next 30 days. All right, we're almost at the end, and I want to give you 3 specific things to track, because this is how you test a theory like this. You make predictions and see if the evidence matches. Prediction number 1, watch whether future attacks continue to specifically target ships using the U.S. Navy-protected southern route near Oman, rather than being evenly spread across all routes through the strait. If the route war theory holds, expect the targeting pattern to stay concentrated on whichever route currently threatens. Iran's preferred northern corridor the most. Prediction number 2, watch war risk insurance premiums over the coming weeks. If this is genuinely about manufacturing economic leverage rather than random violence, expect premiums to keep climbing specifically after each attack, even when the physical damage to any individual ship is minor, because the insurance market prices and probability of future incidents, not just the damage already done. Prediction number 3. Watch whether Iran ever formally announces an actual toll or fee structure for its approved northern route, rather than continuing to only threaten and punish alternative routes. If the 20% liver theory is correct, the eventual goal isn't permanent disruption, it's a functioning monetized route that global shippers eventually accept as the path of least resistance. Here's your homework, and I mean this seriously. I want you to go find the actual KP Lur and windward shipping data for the current month, then compare it to the pre-war baseline of more than 100 ships and 15 million barrels a day. Do that division yourself and ask whether a chaotic, random campaign could plausibly produce that specific, sustained percentage collapse in traffic, or whether that kind of consistent economic damage looks more like the result of a deliberate, targeted strategy. If you find something that contradicts what I've laid out today, come argue with me in the comments. I mean that. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to look at the same data and ask a harder question than, was this one attack random? The question worth asking is this: when 1/5 of the world's oil supply runs through a single 33-mile channel, how much actual force does any single actor really need to use before the rest of the world starts managing itself into compliance out of pure economic fear? Sit with that question. Look at the timeline we covered today: the pre-war export surge, the Strait Authority's written warnings, the specific targeting of the US-backed route, the 70% collapse in oil flow, and I think you'll start to notice something the headlines were never built to show you. I'll see you in the next one.